Hello everybody. For this week's anchor discussion, we're going to be talking about spatial identity from three readings: Lemke 2000, Leander, Phillips and Taylor 2010, and Mills and Comer 2013. So we're going to just do a brief overview of some of the major ideas from these readings. And so we're going to start with Mills and Comer. They talk about a spatial turn in new literacy. So the idea that space matters when we're understanding how semiotics or meaning making occurs, and we want to think about how signs are associated with meanings and objects in relation to place. And if we combine Mills and Comer and Leander, Phillips and Taylor's articles, we can look at the spatial turn and mobilities of learning. So the main argument is that with globalization, we're seeing obviously local and global movements of people, information, goods, and social movements. And these movements are creating new connections, new spaces and places for learning and interaction. And we want to take a look at how these interactions are occurring within new speeds and rhythms. And so that brings in the other reading about timescales. But the main arguments from these authors are, how are these changes affecting education? So when we look at mobilities of learning, a couple ideas that Leander, Phillips, and Taylor looked at are new networks. So we need to consider the relationship between embodied movement, technology, time, and changing virtual geographies. So how are these new networks at play in how we learn? And expanding mobility is another idea where we can see that children and students in this generation and upcoming generations are going to have more opportunities for physical and virtual mobility, and these opportunities are constantly expanding. Lemke 2000 talks about reconceptualizing time. So he starts by looking at classical systems theory and how we tend to define time on a human scale. But he argues that these theories are lacking in that we're not taking into account the changing dynamics of participants in these interactions and non-human participants. So we'll get to that in just a minute. He proposes or talks about eco-social systems, and so he talks about how time scales are invariable. So if you take a look here at the right-hand side, he talks about a short time scale, which are local processes, events, activities, practices, and doings that extend into a faster time scale, which is the adiabatic principle, where we see global extended networks that can predict the intensity of interactions and development of interdependence. And finally, we see artifacts. So he talks about this short time scale and faster time scale interact with artifacts or circulation of documents, books, buildings, bodies, etc., depending on how you define what an artifact is within the larger system. And this creates different time scales of interaction. So these systems are actually quickly moving and changing. So he says, what does this mean for what happens to a student in the classroom and what kind of changes are taking place? So some of the questions that he considers are, how far did these changes carry beyond the walls of the school? On what timescales can we imagine that personal identities change significantly or students' habits of critical reasoning? So extending the conversation beyond the classroom. And he also talks about the ways that it might affect their ability to read, cope with quantitative problems, or interpreting the world around us. And so then this brings us into the idea of morphing or merging identities and interactions, and how our interactions are changing again in these new networks. So we're seeing how our identities are changing with relation to indoor and outdoor spaces, and the idea of streets as place and home, where traditionally children would grow up on the streets and playing outside, and maybe they're not doing that anymore. They're interacting with the community in different ways than they were 20, 30 years ago. And we also talk about co-production of spaces. So these spaces are being produced by those who engage in them. Leander, Phillips, and Taylor also talk about the relationship to the learning space. So they use the classroom as a container space and metaphor, which they argue has been the typical discourse in discussing spatial identity in education. But they want us to think about how we can disrupt and expand on the metaphor of classroom as a container space within educational research. And Lemke also talks about how should we be studying these changes. So he argues it takes a village to study a village, right? So we need to change the way that we do social research. So we should be creating communities of researchers with new communication networks and technologies in order to study these phenomenon, but also think about how can we add more voices to the conversation while considering time scales, because we usually work off of a Eurocentric time scale, for example. And what are some non-human actors that we can incorporate in our interactions? And we also see the idea of role and power come up in the conversation. So we see constricted mobility, where we're seeing different types of interaction within the community. Adults have the power to control children or students' interactional spaces. And so Mills and Comer really bring the argument home that spatiality is intricately linked to power relations and micropolitics in the classrooms. And so finally, if we combine all three of these readings, the main argument that we're considering is how spatiality and timescales in which interaction occurs can be repositioned to create inclusive pedagogies for students and teachers that are able to create spaces that are equitable and accessible. So for this week, Dr. Rich and I would like you to take a look at how space and time are implicated in our considerations of geographies of learning. So these experience geographies can be bound by institutions, like classroom as a container metaphor, or they can be connected across physical and virtual spaces. So create a drawing that represents a particular geography of learning and indicate how space and time are implicated. You can use whatever you want, be creative. It can be realistic or abstract. And then post some commentary along with your drawing in the discussion board, saying how this represents different aspects of space and time in relationship to learning, and based on what we learned from these articles. I've included some examples on the slideshow, so if you'd like to take a look at those, I'm also posting the slides to UB Learns as well. All right, everybody, have fun with this, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.